The shattered silence. Arthur Sterling was a man who lived by the clock and died by the numbers. As the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, he ruled his glass and steel empire with an iron fist. In his world, emotions were a liability, and vulnerability was a death sentence. But there was one variable he could never quite calculate: Elena. She had been his personal assistant for 3 years, the calm in his constant storm. She knew his coffee temperature, his unspoken frustrations, and the exact moment he needed to be left alone. The Monday morning board meeting was the most important of the fiscal year. Billionaires and power brokers sat around a mahogany table, their voices clashing over merger strategies. Arthur sat at the head, a predator in a bespoke navy suit. But his focus wasn't on the charts. It was on Elena, who sat to his left. She was pale, her usual confident posture replaced by a strange, protective slouch. She kept reaching up to adjust a thick silk scarf that didn't match her summer outfit. Suddenly, a gust of wind from the balcony door, left slightly ajar by a departing executive, swept through the room. It caught the tail of Elena's scarf, pulling it back for just 2 seconds. In that fleeting moment, the room's artificial light hit her neck. Arthur saw it, a deep, mottled purple bruise that looked like finger marks. His heart, which he thought was made of ice, felt like it was being gripped by a white-hot hand. The stock prices on the screen became a blur. The voices of the men around him sounded like static. Jealousy, possessiveness, and a dark, uncontrollable protective instinct surged through him. He stood up abruptly, the heavy chair screeching against the floor. "Get out," he said, his voice a terrifying whisper. When no one moved, he roared, "Everyone out, now!" The weight of the secret. The room cleared in seconds. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Elena stood trembling by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, her hand clamped tightly over the scarf. Arthur didn't walk toward her, he stalked. Every step was a warning. He stopped inches from her, the scent of her perfume mixing with the cold air of the room. "Elena, look at me," he commanded. She refused, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Arthur, please, I'm fine." It was just an accident at home. Arthur's eyes darkened. He knew every inch of her routine. He knew she lived alone. He reached out, his fingers brushing the silk. Despite her flinch, he gently unwound the fabric. The mark was even more brutal in the daylight, a clear sign of struggle. "Tripping doesn't leave handprints on a neck," Arthur growled, his hand hovering near the bruise, but afraid to touch it, as if he might break her further. The sight was a trigger, exposing a fragile trust and an unspoken desire he had buried under layers of corporate coldness. He realized that while he had been building his empire, the only person who mattered was suffering in silence. The line between being her boss and her protector didn't just blur, it vanished entirely. "I am going to ask you one more time, and if you lie to me again, I will burn this city down to find the answer myself." The dark reality, Elena's knees buckled, and Arthur caught her, pulling her into his chest. The facade of the powerful CEO was gone. He was just a man desperate to protect his woman. Through choked sobs, the truth finally surfaced. Her younger brother, Leo, had fallen into debt with a ruthless underground loan shark to pay for their mother's medical bills. When Leo couldn't pay, they came for Eleanor. They hadn't wanted money. They wanted a mole inside Sterling Enterprises. They wanted her to leak Arthur's private data. "They told me if I didn't help them, they'd kill him," she whispered against his suit. "I couldn't tell you, Arthur. You're the CEO. You have a reputation. I couldn't drag you into my mess." Arthur felt a cold, calculated fury settle into his marrow. This was no longer just a personal insult. It was a direct declaration of war against everything he held dear. He realized his own obsession with power and his distant corporate persona had made Elena feel like she couldn't turn to him. He spent the next 6 hours in total darkness in his office, lit only by the glowing screens of his private security monitors. He wasn't looking at spreadsheets. He was tracking movements, bank accounts, and locations. He was dismantling the lives of the men who had touched her before he even moved a muscle. By midnight, he knew their names, their families, and their deepest fears. He would show them that when you touch a king's most precious treasure, you don't just lose your money, you lose your life. The breaking point, the following morning, in a secluded warehouse owned by his holding company, the tension reached a boiling point. The men responsible were brought in, expecting a terrified assistant to hand over a flash drive. Instead, they were met with Arthur Sterling. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone was a death sentence. He stood there, watching them with a chilling, detached calm that was far more terrifying than a man who had lost his mind. Elena watched from the shadows of a parked car, her heart racing. She saw a side of Arthur she had never imagined, a man of shadows and absolute ruthlessness. He wasn't just losing control. He was directing his rage with surgical precision. While he dealt with the threat, securing her brother's safety and erasing the debt permanently, Elena felt a shift in her soul. This was the intense CEO romance she had feared. Every glance carried a weight of life and death. When Arthur finally walked toward her, his knuckles were bruised, but his eyes were soft only for her. "It's over," he said, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, avoiding the mark on her neck. "They will never breathe the same air as you again." But as he pulled her into a possessive embrace, Elena felt the dangerous line between protection and control. He had saved her, but he had also claimed her in a way that left no room for her to breathe. She realized that the bruise was just the beginning of a much deeper collision of their worlds. The price of redemption. In the aftermath, the office was never the same. Arthur couldn't go back to being just her boss, and Elena couldn't go back to being just his assistant. The emotional storm had left their old lives in ruins. Arthur realized that to truly keep her safe, he had to stop controlling her. He had to stop being the CEO of her life. In a move that shocked the financial world, Arthur stepped down, handing the reins to his vice president. He took Elena to a quiet estate on the coast of Maine, away from the prying eyes of the press and the shadows of her past. There, under the soft light of the moon, they finally confronted the buried feelings that had sparked the chaos. "I didn't save you because I wanted to own you," Arthur confessed, his voice breaking for the first time in his life. "I saved you because without you, I am just a man in an expensive suit sitting in an empty room." The bruise on her neck eventually faded into a faint memory, but the lesson remained. Every silence they shared now was filled with truth, not secrets. Elena learned to trust his protection, and Arthur learned the vulnerability of love. As they stood on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, the powerful CEO realized that the greatest merger he would ever negotiate was the one between his heart and hers. They were no longer characters in a drama. They were two souls who had survived the storm to find a new, quiet beginning.